Okay, it's ready. It's time to get started. Good evening. Tonight's lecture is on my proposal for speeding up the search for the cure of brain tumors. I'm Al Musella, the president of the Musella Foundation for Brain Tumor Research and Information Incorporated. Let me just get these slide things ready. Okay, here we go. First, the disclosures. I'm the president of the Musella Foundation, and I created the brain tumor virtual trial concept as well as the virtual trial site. I am a founder, pay consultant, and own stock in XCures, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I help author the Promising Pathway Act. I have to give you a little history so you get the context of why I got involved in this and why I feel I have the experience to propose such a change. This is my sister-in-law, Lana. She was diagnosed with glioblastoma in 1992. She went through standard radiation and chemotherapy and surgery. And after the radiation was over, her tumor was bigger than it was before we started. And the doctors basically gave her no hope. They said there's no treatment options available for her. And we were at Sloan Kettering, a major hospital. And they also said she only had about 6 months left to live. We found that that was unacceptable, as she had 4 small kids at the time. She was in the prime of her life. And how could you possibly have no treatment options? This is a look at her MRI, basically right after the radiation was over. This large area is where the tumor was removed, but as you can see, there's tumor everywhere. And this was considered a hopeless case. Back in the year 1992, that was the year the World Wide Web was basically invented. There was no internet options because it was invented that year. They did have CompuServe. So I went to CompuServe and looked for brain tumor support groups, and there were none. So I asked CompuServe if I could create the first one, and they allowed me to. And so I created the first online support group for brain tumors. And since it was the only group, we quickly grew to over 1,000 members. First thing I wanted to do was figure out what treatment options were available. The government had a list of clinical trials, but only the clinical trials that they were performing and that they paid for. They didn't have a list of the ones from the drug companies or investigator-sponsored trials. So the first thing I did is I got my members together and we surveyed every major hospital in the United States, and we created a database of clinical trials. I put it on the internet. Actually, the people at the NIH looked at it and loved it, and they modeled clinicaltrials.gov after my website. They brought me down there and had me explain how everything worked. So we found a bunch of treatment options that were available to her, even though her doctors didn't know about them. So now the next question becomes, if you have multiple options, which one do you pick? There was no clinical trial results available because the clinical trials were still going on. So I thought the easiest way to figure it out would be to survey the members. So we created a registry. I called it the Brain Tumor Virtual Trial Registry. Again, it was the first brain tumor registry online because that's when the internet started. It was all patient-provided data. The patients would enter the tumor type they have, the treatments that they did, and the outcome. And they would update it once a month to let us know how they were doing. So we picked a couple treatment options for my sister-in-law. We tried the fractionated stereotactic radiosurgery plus cisplatin trial, which helped for about a year. Then she went on long-term high-dose tamoxifen, which worked fantastically for about another 5 years for her. Unfortunately, at the end of the 5 years, her insurance ran out. It hit its lifetime maximum. And she stopped taking the drug. She didn't tell us, or we would have helped. It was very expensive at that time. And on the next MRI, she had a recurrence, and then she died shortly thereafter. So I blame the cost of the drug for basically taking her life early. I'll get into it in a few minutes that's one of the reasons we started the co-payment assistance program. But anyway, so getting back to tamoxifen, so we had 1,000 people in the group following her case. So a lot of them tried high-dose tamoxifen. It became very popular. Unfortunately, through the virtual trial, we found out it hardly worked for anybody. Only a handful of people were helped by it, and the vast majority weren't helped at all. So we learned that it wasn't the miracle cure that we thought it was, and we stopped promoting it, which it shows the power of a virtual trial registry, because even in today's current age, we get 1 or 2 individual cases who do well on an alternative treatment, and they're touted all over the internet, and thousands of people try it, but nobody's watching these people. So people try the same thing over and over and over again, even though it's doomed to failure. I formed at the time I was a podiatrist. I was busy in practice, but I was spending so much time on brain tumors, I couldn't really work my practice well. So I formed the Musella Foundation in 1997 so that I could work at this as a full-time job. The year after we formed the foundation, actually 2 years after we formed the foundation, my dad was diagnosed with glioblastoma. That was in 1999, which was also the year Tumor was approved. He was one of the first people to ever get a prescription for Tumor. He had insurance problems too. His insurance policy had a yearly cap of $800 for drugs, which was laughable because the Tumor prescription was thousands of dollars. And he again was told it was hopeless, he was going to die anyway. And he didn't want to leave his wife penniless, so he refused to pay the thousands of dollars for the drug. When we found out, me and my sisters got together, we paid for the drug. And the only way he would take it is if we got it for free. So I told him we got it, free samples from the drug company, so he would take it. So he took the first dose. And stupidly, I didn't realize he also didn't buy the anti-nausea medicine because it was $25 a pill, and his insurance didn't cover it, obviously. So the first day he took the Timidar, he was sick as a dog because he didn't have the anti-nausea pill. And he decided he didn't want to take any more Timidar, and he stopped treatment, and he died less than 6 months after diagnosis. So I also blame insurance issues and drug costs for him not doing as well, which is really why I started the brain tumor co-payment assistance program. Turned out that at that time, about 50%, well, not at that time, a few years later when I started the program, about 50% of patients actually did not get Timidar, and the major reason was the expense, which is horrendous. Since then, we gave out about $10 million in assistance to patients to help them get Timidar, Avastin, and Optune, and now CCNU. I got very involved in brain tumor advocacy. I testified as a patient advocate at the FDA meetings for Avastin and Optune and Glealan, and in many, many, many private meetings to help get drugs approved and treatments approved. I did the same with Medicare. I helped get Timidar, Optune, and Avastin approved for payment for Medicare. I'm also on the patient advisory boards at UCLA's Brain Tumor Center, Duke's Brain Tumor Center, and Northwell's Brain Tumor Center, as well as the grants committee for many, many, many other organizations. Back in about 2016, I met Marty from Cancer Commons. Cancer Commons is a general cancer organization like mine that helps patients find treatment options. They specialize in all cancers, but when they got a brain tumor case, they would usually turn to me to help them with their brain tumor cases. He wound up getting a few very, very wealthy glioblastoma patients. He would turn to me, and together we would form virtual tumor boards with some of the best specialists in the whole world and figure out the best treatment options for patients. And it worked out fantastically. So we were talking, me and Marty, and said, you know, it's horrible that everyday patients can't get access to consideration like this. We have to find a way to make these tumor boards available to every single patient. It's not practical exactly because the wealthy have access to everything and they get treatments that none of us can get. But the concept is to have all the knowledge to find at least the best treatment options so you know what to fight for. So we partnered together to create the program and found quickly we didn't have the resources to do it on a large scale. It's very, very expensive. So Marty had the idea to spin off a for-profit company called XCures. You could visit them at xcures.com. They do the back office stuff for us. They did all the programming for the artificial intelligence software that we use to figure out the best treatment options. They run our registry, which is now FDA regulatory grade. It's not patient-reported data anymore. We get it from medical records. They figured out a better way to take medical records and extract the necessary data. And they help us run the patient navigation program. I tell you all that so that you understand that when I propose a plan like this, it's from years and years of experience and seeing how everything was done over the last 30 years and thinking there has to be a better way. We didn't have that much success over the last 30 years. So here's the 3-point plan. It starts with a patient navigation program, which is made up of the registry, and it's a learning system to find the best treatment options for each patient and to learn from each patient. So it gets better with every single patient. The more patients we get, the better it's going to do. And then I want to overhaul the clinical trial system. Starts with the Promising Pathway Act, which is a new FDA approval pathway of conditional approval that replaces the phase 3 trials with a post-conditional approval virtual registry trial. What that means is instead of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then approval, and then nothing, you get phase 1, phase 2, conditional approval, and then every single patient who uses that drug is in the trial, in the virtual trial, so we figure out the best ways to use it and whether it's good or not. They have 6 years to prove that it's good, or they lose the approval. And then the third part, this is a key, synthetic control groups. You could turn a single-arm trial into randomized trials. One of the biggest problems we've had in the field in the last 30 years, I think, is that 97% of all phase 3 trials fail for brain tumors. That's stunning because they had to do well in a phase 2 trial to get to the phase 3 stage. So how could it do good in a phase 2 trial and then fail a phase 3? It turns out the answer is they used the wrong controls in phase 2. They didn't realize that you can't compare historical data from years ago to patients now, because even though not much progress is made, a little progress is made every year to the point where anything that you compare, even with the standard of care today, you just can't compare it with 5 years ago, no matter what. So they would compare it to an outdated control group and think that it was good. And then when they compared it to the modern day control group, they say it doesn't work. It's no better than the current standard of care. I think we can make synthetic control groups now that work better than a randomized trial. That's like blasphemy for all the statisticians out there, but I think it's true. There were cases recently where randomized trials were criticized because there was differences in the IDH mutations in the 2 different groups. The idea of a randomized trial was to compensate for any unrecognized prognostic factors, such as the IDH mutation that they didn't know about before the trial started. But it turns out it didn't work because there was an imbalance in the IDH mutations to the point where that alone could have accounted for the change seen from the treatment. So even though it was randomized to like the gold standard of, what all the statisticians used to think, the control group still failed us. We could do better. We could do a synthetic control group that's matched to every single known prognostic factor right now and compare and figure out what that one patient is supposed to do, what their survival should be, and see if they do better or worse. You can do it for the whole group of people, or you could even do it for trials of one person. And then as a new prognostic indicator is found, you could just recalculate the control group, and it's based on the registry. The registry that we have is great for this, and we're using it right now for synthetic control groups. But as we enlarge it, it's going to get better and better and better. And we're trying to work with other registries to make it so that we get even larger number of patients to make it even more valid. Okay, I'm going to go to each of the points now. So the patient navigation program, we run it as a clinical trial. It's on clinicaltrials.gov as a patient-centric platform trial for precision oncology. We have a team of neuro-oncologists, PhD researchers, nurse navigators, and me. and we have virtual tumor boards, internal and external. What that means is we have our internal group with the team of neuro-oncologists and PhD researchers and me, and we discuss the case. If we're not sure of something, we bring in outside experts and bring them into the group. And we learn from what they say. And then we record what is said in these groups. And sometimes it could be applied to other cases. So that feeds into our artificial intelligence engine, which also takes data from the medical literature and the tumor boards, as well as from the registry. And it produces a list of plan options that are best for each patient. These plan options could be a clinical trial, it could be experimental treatment, it could be an approved treatment, off-label, or combinations of anything. Any doctor could propose a plan option and put it into our library and actually test it through our system as a virtual trial, just as a screening test to see if it's worth running a real trial, or they could even do the real trial right through our system. And the system will learn so that if that plan option starts to do good, it'll be recommended to a lot more patients. If it's not doing good, it'll be recommended to less patients or nobody. This levels the playing field for the underserved, minority, poor patients who normally wouldn't get access to the best advice and treatments. In the real world, there's basically two levels of care for brain tumor patients. Those who go to the major centers, there's a whole bunch of them. I won't even name them because somebody will feel bad if I leave them out. And they get very good care. And to be honest, they don't really need our system, although with one exception. As I think of it now, when you go to a major center, the chances of them sending you to a different major center are basically zero. They're going to treat you with what they think is the best and never recommend you go to another center for a different clinical trial. Our system does it the opposite way. We find what's the best thing for you and then help you go look for it. Whereas a major center will find what the best thing for you is that they have available. And we're the opposite of a regular clinical trial in that a clinical trial tries to find the best patient for the clinical trial to succeed, whereas we try to find the best treatments for you to succeed. So there's two levels. So you have the major centers, and then you have the rest of the country where it's smaller centers. Usually most of them don't even have a neuro-oncologist. Some of them do, but they don't have the volume of brain tumor patients and the team needed to really do it right. And for those patients, which is really the majority of patients, they need our navigation program to help figure out what's best. Many times, the treatments that we prescribe, like we give a list of 5 to 10 different treatment options. The first 1 or 2 are almost always impossible to get because they're combinations of experimental drugs, and we try to get them, and sometimes we do, but it's rare. And then the last couple options are things that anybody could get. So we always have an option that people can actually get, especially out in a rural area without access to a neuro-oncologist, and just have your oncologist prescribe it. You and your, we give the list to you and your doctor, and you and your doctor pick out which one you want to try, and then we help you get access to it and record the outcomes. So now that brings us to the Promising Pathway Act. So the trouble we had previously was if we prescribe a combination of experimental treatments, or even just one experimental treatment, it's very, very difficult to get it. Only about 5% of adult brain tumor patients get into a clinical trial. A clinical trial is set up to make the drug look good, not to help a patient. So they don't take patients who are bad, like patients who are in bad shape already, elderly, have other diseases. I hate to say this, but even minorities who don't have the money to get into the major centers or to travel, they usually don't get access to the best treatments either. So I helped come up with the Promising Pathway Act. Previously, I worked on the Right to Try pathway, and we got that approved. And I thought that was going to fix all the problems. This is the reason we tried the Right to Try Act. But it turned out the major problem with the Right to Try Act was insurance companies wouldn't pay for it, and some of the drugs were expensive, so very few people got access to drugs through it. So we improved on that, and we improved on accelerated approval. With accelerated approval, there's still just too many barriers to getting accelerated approval. We need access to drugs that by themselves might not be good enough to get approved, but that they would be part of a cocktail approach. For example, there was a vaccine against EGFR that succeeded. It knocked out EGFR, but that by itself didn't help. However, now we have other drugs that we know that if you have EGFR, they're not going to work. And if you knock out EGFR, they will work. So it will go perfectly with the EGFR inhibitor, but you can't get either drug now because either one right now is good enough to use on their own. So what we want to do is get access to drugs that have a biological effect and might not necessarily be good enough to get approved on their own, but they're good enough to be used in our system. So the Promising Pathway Act is a new FDA approval pathway. It's a conditional approval that's time limited to 6 years. You have 6 years to prove that it works. If it doesn't work, you lose the approval. But we should be able to get access to many new drugs with this. And then our patient navigation system will figure out how best to use them and if they're useful or not. Not just our system, obviously, this is for all types of serious diseases. Every group can, every group could have their own patient navigation system and do this type of stuff. And groups of doctors could do this type of stuff also. This should cut off, this should cut off at least 75% of the time and 90% of the cost of getting a drug approved, to the point where I know of so many drug candidates right now that deserve to be approved, but they can't raise the money to get through the approval pathway. We will take those as nonprofits and push them through the system and get FDA approval and sell them at a reasonable cost with the profits going back into the system to find the next drug until we find the cure. All patients who use a drug approved under this pathway have to agree to be followed in the registry. There's penalties to the drug company if patients aren't followed in the registry, because we have to learn from each patient, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Most insurance companies will pay for the drugs. Medicare will, and other insurance companies are encouraged, and the bill explains how that gets complicated, and it's being worked on right now. Patients must consent to use treatments approved under this pathway the same way they would consent to a clinical trial, and release the liability to the doctor and manufacturer, and acknowledge that they understand the risks. They don't have to use these drugs. If they're not comfortable with using a drug not approved through the full pathway, they just don't have to use it. But this gives doctors and organizations like mine the ability to use these drugs in combination and find something that actually works and make a difference in our lifetime. We'll eventually find the cure, but at the current rate of improvement, it's really going to be over 100 years before we find the cure. I think using my system, we could do this in less than a decade and have a cure. Then finally, synthetic control groups. I talked a little bit about them already. First of all, they should theoretically be able to get rid of placebos. I hate placebos, and I hate standard of care arms in trials, because if you go to the trouble of trying to find the best treatment option, and then a computer flips a coin basically and says, no, you're not going to get it, that's not fair. And that's basically just to satisfy statistics that were developed over 100 years ago using randomization that has been proven basically not to work right now. We can do better. We have new statistical techniques that allow us to use data from our registry, combine it with other brain tumor registries to calculate the control groups. This allows you to evaluate a single arm trial in a much better way by creating a virtual randomized trial out of it. So you'll be able to run phase 2 trials in a way that is more valid than current phase 3 trials and at way less cost. And then as the new markers get known, you can easily recalculate the synthetic control group. So you don't have to throw away a clinical trial and start from scratch, which has been done before. And the recent DC VaxL trial made excellent use of a synthetic control group, and it was the first major brain tumor trial to do it the right way. I'm sure there's going to be questions about that. Okay, so summary. Our plan to speed up the search for the cure. You start with finding the best treatment options available and help patients get access. Then you follow every patient as if they were in a clinical trial, so we learn from every patient's experiences. Figure out the cause of resistance or recurrence and target it, and keep iterating until you find the cure for that patient. And then you look for other patients with similar problems and see if you can generalize that knowledge. We want to transform the drug development process to drastically cut down the cost and time needed to get a drug approved. This will give us many more choices, which can be further refined by the patient navigation program. It should also drastically reduce the cost of these new drugs. Many of the new drugs coming out, like the CAR T cells, those CAR T cells that were over $2 million a dose. It's starting to get almost ridiculous to the point where what use is a drug if you just can't afford it? And we're talking about combinations of drugs. Many of the brain tumor drugs, even the best combination of approved drugs we have now is at least $40,000 or $50,000 a month. That gets to be unaffordable if you have to do something like that for 3 years. I think we get drugs down much cheaper, still make profit for the drug companies, or don't tell the drug companies I said this, but maybe even bypass some drug companies and basically do it ourselves. And then use synthetic control groups to validate the single-arm trials and avoid the mistakes of using unmatched historical controls, which overestimate the treatment effect. They always overestimate treatment effect because standard of care gets better every year. So if you're using old historical controls, it's always going to make the drug look good when it's not. We want to avoid that mistake. The biggest criticism we have, let me stop this for a second. The biggest criticism we have is people are saying experimental drugs offer no hope. We don't know if anything in the experimental section is good until we finish the clinical trials, and then we know that they're good. But the trouble is, each clinical trial, like the DCVax trial, was actually 20 years long. This is for people who live about a year or two. So you're talking about at least 10 generations of patients died waiting to find out if it's good, when we kind of knew it was in the beginning, and that it had very little side effects. So if we could have given it back then, we could have saved 20 or 30,000 lives. So this is one patient's experience with a program that we have. I told you about a few of our programs. There's many more programs that we do. One of them was we started an expanded access program of a pediatric brain tumor drug. The reasoning for that is our panel kept recommending this drug over and over and over for DIPG and DMG patients, and we could never get it for the patients. There was a small clinical trial going on, and nobody could get into it because it was too rigid and there was so few spots available. And they had an expanded access program that closed down after just a couple of patients because they were overwhelmed. They just didn't have the resources to run it. So the Musella Foundation worked with Cancer Commons and XCures to fund and run the program. We treated about 133 kids and young adults. And I'll let this patient's mother explain what happened in her case.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell my story today. I am Anne, a mother of a brain tumor patient, my 11-year-old son Anatole. Anatole was diagnosed with a diffuse midline glioma in May 2018. During the following month, he went through proton beam radiation and chemotherapy to no avail. The tumor kept growing, and my son was getting worse and worse. He had trouble with vision, he had pain, weakness in his arm and leg, and he became wheelchair-bound. He was so weak, he no longer was able to go to school. Soon, we were told by our doctors that nothing more could be done for our son but palliative care, and that he probably would die in a few months. In the meantime, we learned of a new experimental drug called ONC201 that was having some success for my son's type of tumor. This drug was only available in clinical trials. We tried to get into one of these trials 4 times, and 4 times we were told no. Either Anatole didn't qualify for the trial, or the trial doctor thought his tumor was too large, growing too fast, and that my son was not in good enough shape to undergo the treatment. It costed us a lot of money, a lot of energy, and we wasted many weeks just to be told he couldn't get the drug. In despair, we turned to the Musella Foundation for help. Dr. Musella just started an expanded access program for ONC201, and his team helped us get the drug. Anatol started taking the drug in April 2019, and it worked for him. He slowly got better without any side effects from the drug. The tumor shrunk. His MRIs have shown a huge regression of more than 80%, and now the tumor is stable. He still has some physical impairments, but he lives a life as normal as he can. He can not only walk, but he can play soccer with his dad, and he can even ride his bicycle again. He is a happy kid, enjoying life. It is now over 3 years after starting the drug, and he still takes it. 3 years ago, we were told the end was near, and there was no hope of anything helping. Without this drug, we would have lost our son. My point in telling you our story is to show that access to new drugs is crucial when we talk about serious diseases like brain tumors. I have become very involved in the pediatric brain tumor community, and I've been able to identify 3 factors that patients face when they are looking for a cure. Drug access. For a lot of patients, as for us, access to clinical trials or compassionate use or the right to try is the first obstacle we have to face. Access to new treatments must be facilitated for all patients willing to try. These patients often have no other better option than these drugs. Drug combination. For the moment, there are no effective approved treatments, but there are many experimental treatments. And even if the drug works for my son, I also know it only works for a small percentage of kids. As we know for now, there are other drugs that might work in combination with this drug, and which may help other kids. However, combinations of drugs are not allowed outside of clinical trials. Plus, each of the components of the ultimate cocktail might not be good enough on their own to get FDA approval. The ultimate cure resulting from a combination of different new treatments must be made possible and supported by the system. Time. Time is running fast when your life is threatened by a tumor. Eventually, the best combinations which would help the most kids will be identified, but unfortunately, it will take too long and many kids will suffer and die in the meantime. Access to new drugs and their combinations must be urgently implemented. Considering those 3 elements, Dr. Musella is trying to change the way drugs get developed. His plan with the Promising Pathway Act will actually help accessing new treatments. His patient navigation program will be the fastest way of finding and testing new combinations. His plan of using artificial control groups to gauge if these combinations are working will all help to cut years off of the process. These obstacles need to be overcome today. The Promising Pathway Act offers a strategy for a larger, a faster, more accurate access to new drugs and their possible combinations. It will definitely help us go in this direction and save many, many, many lives. Thank you for your attention.
That was wild. I just wanted to say, before I said Kent's Commons and Musella Foundation and XCures ran the program, we had help from the Michael Mosier Defeat the APG Foundation and also the Cure Starts Now Foundation, as well as a few other organizations that donated some of the money for it. Okay, so now how can you help? First, we need to get help passing the Promising Pathway Act. Right now, it's stuck in a committee, And we need you to write to your representatives now. And we made it very easy. Just go to virtualtrials.org and click on Promising Pathway Act and you fill out the form and it sends an email for you automatically. It figures out who your representatives are. There's a stock letter. You could use that, or you could edit it however you like. Have your friends and family and pets, no, not pets, do it as well. If you have connections in Congress, you use them. And then donations are badly needed. Our patient navigation program is overwhelmed. We need to hire more people. We also need donations to fund the co-payment assistance program, our Brain Tumor Research Grant program, and just to run the foundation. COVID hit us pretty hard for the last couple of years. We used to have a lot of 5K fundraisers, and now we're down to about 3. And one of them is virtual, and the turnouts are very poor compared to how they used to be in the old days. So instead of making up a fundraiser, just donate, make it easier. It's like when your kids come to you and they want to sell candy to you, I'd rather just give them the money. So please just go make a donation, virtualtrials.org, click donate. And then XCures, which powers most of our patient navigation program and the registry, along with Cancer Commons, they're looking to set up this B round of funding, the Series B round of funding. So for the large investors out there, this is not for us ordinary people. Contact me and I'll set you up with them. It's probably a very, very good investment, but it's a large investment. And that's it. I hope you at least write those letters. Let me just stop sharing my screen. And we can start taking some questions. First, in the chat, I see a link to the mother's video. That's a different video than the one that she had. I'm sorry for the sound. It sounds good on my computer. I don't know how Zoom messed it up, but I'll try to post it some place and I'll add a link to it later. Let's quick questions. Just give me a second. I gotta turn off PowerPoint and get back into Facebook and our chat room. There we go. Okay. Okay, I see there's a lot of questions about DCVax. Maybe we'll save that for the end. Of course, I don't, nothing other than what was already presented. See, now somebody's asking about where to go for the Promising Pathway Act. Let me see if I could share my screen again. Okay, this is our website. Go to virtualtrials.org. Click on Activism Alert. Click here to support the Promising Pathway Act. That brings you to this page. It basically tells you about the act. If you click on Learn More, you could actually see the wording of everything. Here's the bill right here. Click on that, you get the bill. So to take action, you just put your street address, zip, and you select a group. Are you a brain tumor patient, DIPG patient, a doctor? And for Florida residents only, there's a special thing. Other or a parent of a brain tumor patient. And that'll help customize the letter for you. So once you put your street address in, well, I could show you. And I'll take doctor. So this tells me that Senator Schumer, Gillibrand, and Representative Rice are my representatives. This is the subject, and this is what the body of the letter would be. I have to finish filling in my contact information, and I click send. That's finished. Oh, next webinar. Well, I'm here. I might as well tell you about the next webinar. Is going to be May 22nd. topic is stereotactic radiosurgery, the treatment of choice for people with vestibular schwannomas by Dr. Michael Schulder. That should be very interesting. He's the president of the neurosurgery, of the Stereotactic Radiosurgery Congress. So he knows all there is about stereotactic radiosurgery. And since everybody's asking about DC Vax, if you click on, let's go back to the homepage, news alert, results of the long-awaited DC Vax trial. If you click that video, which I'm not going to do because it's a long one, it's a presentation of the phase 3 clinical trial results and explains everything. You could click there to pop up the slide deck. And these are all the slides that they use with the results. The one question I always get is, let me see. The progression-free survival curve and discussion. People can't seem to understand this, but it's simple. It's very easy. Progression-free survival is not an endpoint of the trial. It was the original endpoint when they invented, when they wrote the trial protocol, but they quickly found out it was not practical because with immunotherapies, it's very hard to tell when there's progression, because in immunotherapy, when it works, it creates swelling and inflammation that look on MRI like it's progression. So they call it progression much earlier. So progression-free survival it becomes a cloudy endpoint. Progression-free survival was picked originally to make the trial shorter, which is a laugh because it was a 20-year trial. But progression-free survival was thought to be a surrogate endpoint for overall survival, which is really what we want. We want to see overall survival difference. As a matter of fact, during the Avastin trials, there was a big progression-free survival advantage, but there was no change in overall survival. And the reason for that is the Avastin just hid the progression because it made the blood vessels less leaky, so there was less swelling. And by getting rid of the swelling, it made the tumor look like it was getting smaller. So they judged that it was not progression, even in cases where it was really massively progressing. So the FDA after that said progression-free survival is not a good endpoint for brain tumors right now. So the trial changed from progression-free survival to overall survival. And by having progression-free survival was actually longer in the control arm than the treatment arm, that means that there was inflammation taking place and the treatment was actually working. So this is actually a good finding. They probably shouldn't have even put this slide in because it created so much headaches. The important thing is when you get to overall survival, let me get to the overall survival. This is where they talk about the external control groups. It's very good reading. They looked at all different prognostic factors. Here's the prognostic factors, and they checked each one and matched everybody to the 10 clinical trials where all the prognostic factors were known, and it's a valid control group. So here's the overall results. For newly diagnosed glioblastoma, survival tail is at 5 years after randomization, 13% of the people with the vaccine were alive versus 5.7% of the people without the vaccine. That's a huge difference. It doesn't sound great, but it's more than double the survival. But so what's happening is the vaccine is working for a small percentage of the people, but when it works tremendously. Same with recurrent. The survival tail, at 2 years, it was 20% with the vaccine versus 9% without, and 11% versus 5% at 30 months. So it's more than double at all these different time points. So the vaccine is good. It's not perfect, but the best thing is we need to get this FDA approved now so we could use it and start combination trials of it. Like we already know that using an immune enhancer will make the vaccine work better. Using a checkpoint inhibitor will make it work better. Probably using Optune will make it work better. There's so many combinations we could try, but we're not going to be able to try them until it's approved. So we need it approved, even if you don't believe that doubling survival is worthy. That in itself is worthy to me, especially when you consider the side effect profile. It's like getting the flu shot. You get mild symptoms at the time of the injection into your arm, and that's it. So that's all I have to say about DC Vax for right now. Let me get back to some of these questions. Okay, has PPA been assigned to a particular committee? Yes. I don't remember what the name of the committee is. You could easily look up Promising Pathway Act and find the current status, see what committee it's in. The next question is, I like the general concept. How do you know that combinations of drugs that have never been tried before will not be too toxic systemically, which is a major limitation of combination targeted therapies? That's an excellent question. The answer is you don't. But the answer is, with our system, the first person or the first few people to try it and find that it's too toxic, they're going to suffer the consequences of it. But we record the results and nobody else will have that problem. Under the current system where everybody is not being tracked, doctors are going to try that combination anyway. They're going to see that the patient died and that knowledge is lost. Then the next doctor is going to try the same thing and that patient's going to die. Then that patient's going to try it, then that next doctor is going to try it and that patient's going to die. So they'll each learn about an individual case. And until enough patients die where it becomes too obvious, then somebody will publish about it 6 months later. You might have 50 people dead instead of, in our case, if it's something that kills immediately, you have that 1 or 2 patients. So I know that sounds terrible, but also we have, like one of our PhDs basically studies that field. He's a pharmacologist who studies targeted therapies. He understands how these should interact, and he could theoreticize which ones are going to be too toxic. Like, you know that if you take something like Optune, which has absolutely no systemic toxicities, the only problem is skin irritation, and you take DC Vax, which has no toxicity at all, you combine those two, and you're going to have no toxicity at all. If you had a checkpoint inhibitor, you're going to get some toxicity. If you had 2 checkpoint inhibitors, you might get a lot of problems. And if you had another immune enhancer, then you might start getting into problems. But we could start off easy. You start with the ones that you know are going to be relatively easy to take. And then you slowly add something else in. You could even, the way the FDA likes to do these things, you start at a dose that's too low to even help, which I'm not really for. Like, if I was a patient and I was going to take a risk on one of these things, I would say, give me the full dose. I would take the risk, because I'd rather take the risk of a full dose with the benefit of possibly curing it, instead of taking the risk of having a small risk from it and not being able to get any benefit from it. And that's the whole key of, if every single patient is being followed, we won't repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again like we are now. Ed, I hope we can get your PowerPoint slides. They're excellent. Sure, just send me an email and I'll send the slides. Let me see if there's any other questions hanging around. Well, we're getting off easy. That's what it looks like. Let me check Facebook. Can we only have one submit the letters to Congress just forwarded to them? No, you have to, but when you fill out that form, it'll get submitted to both congressmen and your representative automatically. So you really only have to write it once and it goes to all 3 of them. And I don't see any more questions. Are there any more questions? Yes, especially on Zoom. And then it looks like we are finished. Wait, there's one more question. Okay, there's a question about, can a nonprofit really get drugs approved? I'm working on a couple plans. We have the DIPG All-In Initiative, which is a group of organizations working to speed up the cure for DIPG. And one of the projects they're working on now is doing the preclinical testing and the first-in-man testing of drugs for the IPG, with the idea of you get enough data so that the big cooperative groups will take it on as a phase 1 trial or phase 2 trial. We could use that same concept with any drug. I know so many different candidates now that trying to get into first-in-man trials. We could set up a assembly line process of a few centers who are willing to do these things. We could use our platform trial as the basis of it. We don't even have to do too much FDA paperwork. And we have a IRB, a national IRB that's on our side. We run it by them. If they allow it, we could try some of these combinations. I'm sorry, we could try some of these new drugs. And we do it as a screening. If we have 5 new drugs every year, we'll take the best of the 5 in the early screening tests and in the early in human trials, and then put them into a phase 1 trial. And then of the first 5 phase 1 trials, we'll take the best 1 or 2 and put it into a phase 2 trial and get that right through to FDA approval. And I feel that even after the phase 1 trial, we'll know which drugs are going to do well in the phase 2 trials because we'll have the matched control groups. So using that whole system, we should be able to get drugs through rather quickly. And once we get one drug through, it'll make enough money for us to do a whole bunch of other drugs behind it. So we'll just iterate over and over and over again. And we're not going to be married to just one drug. That's one of the faults. Many drug companies have 1 drug or 2 drugs. And it's so important to them that they can't let it fail. With us, since you're not married to it, if it's not looking good, you just drop it and try something else. Let me see. And that looks like it's about it. So I'm going to call the end of this, and we'll see you next week with Dr. Schulte talking on stereotactic radiosurgery. Have a good evening, and I hope you found this informative. Good night.